Hello, Ambassadors. We begin a new study today that will take us through the month of August. I'm calling it Four Weddings and a Funeral. The reference to the 1990s British romantic comedy is apparent in the title, but don't expect Hugh Grant or Andie MacDowell to make an appearance. Instead, we're going to look at four weddings and one funeral in the Bible to try to glean some insights from them. Now, I'm recording this video in advance of our Zoom class on August the 2nd, in case some of you want to do further review or further study, or even share it with your friends so you can invite them to join us in Ambassadors. Today we're looking at the marriage of Jacob to Leah and Rachel. Now let's think about the background for a moment. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. You know those names. They're strung together through the Bible many times to signify the patriarchs of Israel, God's chosen people, in the line of the promise that God made to Abraham in Genesis 12. God told Abraham he would make of him a great nation. Now, with the birth of Abraham's son Isaac, God's promise began to be fulfilled. Then Jacob was born to Isaac and Rebekah. Through Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, God was forming his chosen people who would one day produce the one who was predicted in Genesis 3:15, the one who would defeat Satan, the Messiah, Jesus Christ. Now, Jacob spent his youth living as a nomad in the land of Canaan with his parents, Isaac and Rebekah, and his twin brother Esau. But rivalry and deception involving Esau forced Jacob to flee for safety to Rebekah's family in Haran. While Jacob was away, he married two wives and had two concubines. Now, when you read that expression concubine, think in terms of the old practice of common law marriage. You know, some states many years ago, and some states even today, have a practice of common law marriage where a couple can live together and hold themselves out as being husband and wife, and the law recognizes them that way. We don't have that in California, but some states still do. So anyway, Jacob married and wound up with these four women: Rachel, Leah, Zilpah, and Bilhah. And all of them gave him a number of children, including 12 sons. These 12 sons would go on to form the 12 tribes that made up the Jewish nation of Israel, which was named after Jacob, whose name was changed by God to Israel. We'll begin by reading Genesis 29, the text beginning with the second part of verse 14. After Jacob had stayed with him for a whole month, Laban said to him, "Just because you're a relative of mine, should you work for me for nothing? Tell me what your wages should be." Now Laban had two daughters. The name of the older was Leah, and the name of the younger was Rachel. Leah had weak eyes, but Rachel had a lovely figure and was beautiful. Jacob was in love with Rachel and said, "I'll work for you 7 years in return for your younger daughter Rachel." Laban said, "It's better that I give her to you than to some other man. Stay here with me." So Jacob served 7 years to get Rachel, but they seemed like only a few days to him because of his love for her. Then Jacob said to Laban, "Give me my wife. My time is completed, and I want to make love to her." So Laban brought together all the people of the place and gave a feast. But when evening came, he took his daughter Leah and brought her to Jacob, and Jacob made love to her. And Laban gave his servant Zilpah to his daughter as her attendant. When morning came, there was Leah. So Jacob said to Laban, "What is this you've done to me? I served you for Rachel, didn't I? Why have you deceived me?" Laban replied, "It's not our custom here to give the younger daughter in marriage before the older one. Finish this daughter's bridal week, and then we'll give you the younger one also, in return for another 7 years of work." And Jacob did so. He finished the week with Leah, and then Laban gave him his daughter Rachel to be his wife. Laban gave his servant Bilhah to his daughter Rachel as her attendant. Jacob made love to Rachel also, and his love for Rachel was greater than his love for Leah, and he worked for Laban another 7 years. Unfortunately, we're still not able to get together as a group, but I hope you've had some time to reflect on the questions that I posed in the study guide. Question 1. What do you know about Rachel and Leah? Well, Leah was the older, homely sister of the beautiful Rachel. And when the young, desirable suitor Jacob asked to marry Rachel, No one mentioned that custom dictated that the older sister had to marry first. Instead, Leah and Rachel's conniving father, Laban, tricked Jacob into marrying Leah before he let Jacob also marry Rachel. Now we can imagine the misery Leah had felt all of her life when she compared herself to her sister. And then she was trapped in a marriage that she shared with her beautiful sister. Leah was not loved by Jacob, but Rachel was desired and treasured. So when she gave birth to a son before Rachel, Leah found some comfort in knowing that God had noticed her misery. No matter what causes our misery, we can find the same comfort that Leah felt. The Bible promises in Psalm 34:18, "The Lord is close to the brokenhearted. He rescues those whose spirits are crushed." So God gave Leah a son, and she saw that gift as confirmation that God had noticed her circumstance. We can pay close attention to our lives and notice the gifts that God gives because He cares for us. As the scripture declares in Lamentations 3:22, "The faithful love of the Lord never ends. His mercies never cease." When we look for His mercies, we're likely to find them. Well, now, Jacob's family was one big mess. Think about all the sins involved. There was pride, there was greed, there was deceit, there was jealousy, there was sexual immorality, and there was spite. Sounds a lot like the modern family, doesn't it? It sounds a lot like families I've seen as I've done family law through the years. But do you know which sin is the most heinous of all in his story? The sin that opened the floodgate for all the others? It was the fact that, except when God was giving them what they wanted, Jacob, Laban, Leah, and Rachel never spoke of God. Go back through and read Genesis 29 and 30, and you'll find that that's true. They thought the only thing God was good for was to meet their selfish desires. And maybe that's a sin that we can relate to as well. Some of us only pray when we're in trouble. Some of us only pray for ourselves. Some of us only obey because we want God to do something for us. And some of us only praise God when He does what we want. That was the sin that tore apart Jacob's family. Question 2. What do you make of Laban's words in Genesis 29:15? Is he just being nice, or is something else going on? If you think about the story of Jacob and Laban, you'll find that they're two birds of a feather. They're both quintessential con men. And what's going on here is God is schooling Jacob. Remember, this happens just 1 month after he arrived in Haran. Laban offered a bargain that seemed friendly and proper enough on the surface, but that must have humbled Jacob greatly. Laban said, "Just because you're a relative of mine, should you work for me for nothing? Tell me what your wages should be." That's Genesis 29:15. Now, on the surface, Laban seemed to be going beyond what the relationship of a relative to a relative demanded, because he's offering to pay Jacob in addition to merely giving him hospitality. But actually, what he's doing is he's giving notice to Jacob that he's not going to entertain him indefinitely. Jacob's going to have to work for his keep. And from this time on, Laban's going to regard him primarily as a servant. He's going to work for Laban, and in return, he'll receive wages. Question 3. Compare this story with Genesis 27. What do they have in common? How are they different? For the first time in the narratives, Jacob was the object of deception, not the deceiver. Jacob had had the tables turned on him by Laban. The similarity between what Laban did to Jacob and what Jacob had done to Isaac back in Genesis 27 should be clear. You see, what he did in Genesis 27 is Jacob exchanged his place as the younger son for the place of Esau, the older twin. What Laban did here is he reversed the trick, and he exchanged the older, less desirable Leah for the younger, more desirable Rachel. You see, Jacob was getting what he deserved. In this light, the 7 extra years that Jacob had to serve Laban kind of appear like a repayment for the way he'd treated his brother Esau. By calling these kinds of situations to the attention of the reader, the writer of Genesis begins to draw an important lesson from these narratives. Jacob's deceptive schemes for obtaining the blessing did not meet with God's approval. Now, through Jacob's plans, God's will had been accomplished, but the writer of Genesis is pointing out that the schemes and tricks that Jacob engaged in were not God's plan. Question 4. Read this passage from the viewpoint of Leah. What was life like for Leah? Her father didn't value her, and God only knows what happened to her mother. She was betrayed by her father, who used her as a consolation prize to Jacob. Laban thought she was second class, and he dumped her off on Jacob. If he'd been a wise father, he would have known that Leah was gifted. She wasn't gifted in the same way her sister was, but she was gifted just the same. His other daughter, Rachel, was beautiful. Leah wasn't what you would traditionally call beautiful, but she had strength, and God would use her in a mighty way. So, women, just because you may not be gifted like someone else doesn't mean you're not gifted. God never made a worthless child. Leah had worth. It just wasn't the kind of worth that was obvious to her father or even to Jacob. She found herself entangled with the same kind of a man for a husband that she had for a father. He wasn't very kind to her, but that wasn't anything new. In fact, it was familiar. Almost like a magnet draws metal, we can seemingly draw similar circumstances in our lives. Thank God he knows how to make the negatives turn into positives. He can wean you from your past mistakes. How can you have faith that you're accepted when at times you feel rejected? Well, basing faith on feelings is disastrous for all of us. Feelings change, but God never does. When we exercise faith in what God has said, based on our faithful God and his faithful word, our minds and our hearts will be renewed. Begin telling yourself the truth about your complete acceptance in Christ. During those times when you feel rejected by a special person, know that God has promised to walk into the darkness of your healing journey and shed light on your path. Despite the pain of past rejection, keep looking at the light of God's promise never to leave you, never to forsake you. Question 5. If you were making a movie of this story, whom would you cast as Rachel? We can see the problem up close in this Bible story that rivals anything Jerry Springer could come up with. It's the twisted story of a guy named Jacob who becomes smitten by a beauty named Rachel. And we're told Rachel was lovely in form and beautiful. That's the biblical way of saying she was smoking hot. Supermodel Bella Hadid has been declared the most beautiful woman in the world after she passed a science test that determines what constitutes the perfect face. She's 23 years old, and she was found to be 94.35% accurate to the golden ratio of beauty. Well, maybe a better question would be, whom would you cast as Leah? It's really not clear what the expression means when you read that she had tender or delicate eyes, or weak eyes, some translations say. The expression may mean she had appealing eyes. Some translations take it that way, the New American Bible, the New Revised Standard, and the New Living Translation. But most seem to suggest that her eyes were kind of plain. They really didn't have the brightness that you'd normally expect. Either way, she didn't measure up to her gorgeous sister. When I read that Leah had weak eyes, I kind of think of Renee Zellweger, though in fact I really think Renee's pretty hot. But maybe casting her against Catherine Zeta-Jones in Chicago might be a good comparison of Rachel and Leah. Question 6. How is Jacob feeling in Genesis 29:18? After Jacob's long journey, he laid eyes for the first time on the beautiful Rachel, and he was smitten. All the old cliches applied to him in that moment. He fell, he flipped, he was lightning struck, he was head over heels, he'd lost his heart. Do you remember when you fell in love for the first time? It may have been that boy or girl in your grade school class. If you were like me, the objects of your crush never even knew you existed. Do you remember when you first laid eyes on the person who was to be your spouse? Was it love at first sight? It certainly looks like that might have been the case with Jacob. But really, what's so remarkable about that? He had just walked off the backside of the desert, and the first thing he saw was a stunningly beautiful woman. Being a red-blooded Hebrew male, he noticed her. I mean, he really noticed her. But when you think about it, Jacob didn't know Rachel from Eve. He didn't know a thing about her. At that point, all he knew was that Rachel was beautiful in every way, with a lovely face and a shapely figure. That's the way the New Living Translation puts it. Now, that physical attraction may be normal and nice, but really it's not that remarkable. What is remarkable is when two people have been looking at each other year after year and they love each other more than ever. That's remarkable. It's when a man and a woman stay loyal and steadfast and loving through the long years and the peaks and valleys of life. That's worth talking about. Question 7. Think back on Jacob's life. How much work do you think he had done before this? Poor Jacob. Jacob had never worked for anybody. He was probably industrious to a degree, and he'd certainly done things around the home of his mother and father in Beersheba. But when you read about his home life there, you find that he really wasn't the one who went out and worked. He hung around the house with his mother. But he was the son of a patriarch. He hadn't served others. Others had served him. Besides, do you recall the oracle that was associated with his birth that had said, the older will serve the younger? Genesis 25:23. In other words, Esau would serve Jacob. But here you've got Jacob serving his uncle Laban. Question 8. How do you imagine Jacob's tone in Genesis 29:21? The deceiver has been deceived. Jacob demands of Laban, "Give me my wife. My time is completed. I want to make love to her." Now that suggests that Laban was holding out. He was extorting as much as he could from Jacob before giving him the promised wife. He doesn't even say, "Please give me my wife." And just the solitary "give me" is the language of grievance. Ostensibly, Laban complied, doing the right thing and hosting a wedding feast. The typical wedding featured processions to and from the bride's dwelling, and there was also the reading of the marriage contract, and the feast was attended by families and the community. And the first day's festivities ended with the groom wrapping his cloak around the bride and taking her to his tent where the marriage was consummated. Following that, the feast would continue for 6 more days. Question 9. Genesis 29:25. How is Jacob feeling now? Jacob was indignant. "Why have you deceived me?" But he was left speechless by Laban's reply. "It's not our custom here to give the younger daughter in marriage before the older one." And after that, the narrative just says that Jacob conceded the point. Verse 28. Unbeknownst to him, Laban's words had deftly expressed the very circumstances that had led Jacob on his present journey. It was the result of him cheating Esau that led to him being cheated by Laban. The irony speaks for itself. Certainly, the reader of the Bible is expected to interpret that irony as the work of God's plan. Jacob's past had caught up with him, and he could only accept the results and serve Laban another 7 years. At first, it looked as if Jacob's journey was in fact following the course that Rebekah had anticipated. When Rebekah sent Jacob away, she told him to stay with her brother Laban for a while, literally a few days, Genesis 27:44. So it doesn't surprise us to read that Jacob's first 7 years of working for Laban seemed like they were only a few days. But when he discovers Laban's trick, 7 more years are added to Rebekah's few days, and Jacob's and Rebekah's plans began to unravel. Evidently, Laban used the fact that the bride was veiled on the wedding evening, the late hour, and probably a lot of wine to get Jacob's senses dulled in order to effect the switch, and it worked perfectly. As to what Laban did to restrain Rachel, we don't know. And more, Leah had to be a most willing bride. She must have loved Jacob and despised her sister. Nice work, Laban. Question 10. How common is lying in our culture? Adopting the policy of radical honesty Squeaky clean honesty will put you at odds with our culture. In the words of David Callahan, we live in a cheating culture. He's written a rather depressing book by that title. Here are some quick facts. Now, when you think about these, keep in mind that people lie when they fill out surveys. They over-report their good behavior and they under-report their bad behavior. So when 59% of high school students admit to cheating, we can be sure that the actual number of cheaters is much higher. But here's what we admit to. 59% of high school students admit to cheating. 43% of workers admit to cheating on the job. 75% of workers observe someone else cheating on the job. 41% of married people admit to infidelity in marriage. I found a conversation online that kind of puts flesh to these statistics. A questioner on Yahoo asked if a white lie is wrong, and here are some of the responses. It depends. Well, yeah, I guess it does. It depends on whether you are doing the lying or being lied to. No one likes being lied to. I think it's wrong 100% of the time for you to lie to me, but I might think it's okay for me to lie to you when it suits me. Someone said, if you never told a white lie, this world would be a very unhappy place. What's the implication? Your happiness is all that's important? Someone said, well, it depends. A white lie told in good faith might do more good than harm. So it all depends on what your intention is. The idea that they're getting across is lying isn't always wrong, so white lies aren't always wrong. That's just like saying there is no right and wrong, only what's necessary. We live in a culture of liars, and if you choose to follow the biblical standard, you'll be swimming upstream against culture. There was a University of Notre Dame study a while back that asked more than 100 volunteers to count how many times they were dishonest during a 10-week study, but it told half the group to make a concerted effort to tell the truth at all times. By the end of the study, those who simply counted their lies and did nothing to avoid them wound up with more sore throats, headaches, and mood swings compared with those who worked hard to be honest. I read about a parent who was called into school because his son was caught stealing pencils from another student. And the man chastised his son in the principal's office. He said, I would have taken a stack of pencils from the office if I'd only known you needed them. You see what the point is? The more distance we have from the source we're stealing from, the easier it is for us to steal. We rationalize that we're not taking money from someone's pocket if it's our large company. And we'd never grab a few dollars from a singer's wallet, but we might not consider an illegal download of her song to be stealing. The point of this is, dishonesty is the rule. It's the norm of our world. And for us to follow the biblical pattern of radical honesty is going to make us run counter to the world. For those of us who want to reduce how often we lie and cheat, here's some advice. You have to first recognize that it's not only bad people who lie, and you have to recognize times when you're not being completely honest. Maybe that's the lesson we're supposed to get from the story of Jacob and Laban, along with Rachel and Leah. Well, that's the first lesson in our series on 4 weddings and a funeral, and I hope maybe you and I can learn from Jacob and Laban the importance of radical honesty. Next week, we'll take a look at the Song of Solomon. I suspect you haven't heard many lessons, if any, on the Song of Solomon. So I hope you'll do some preparation for it before we come back together next week. In the meantime, the Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace. Amen.